March 1968, Western Pacific. The Sea of Japan is black water under a low ceiling of cloud, the kind of late winter gloom that erases the horizon and turns sky and sea into one continuous slab of cold grey. Below it, at periscope depth, a narrow steel cylinder pushes silently forward. USS Swordfish, SSN 579. Inside the control room, the world is reduced to red light, glowing instruments, and the constant hum of machinery. The air smells of amine from the CO2 scrubbers, hot oil from the reduction gears, and coffee that has been on since the previous watch. Condensation beads along chilled piping. Somewhere aft, the S4W reactor plants a low vibration in the deck plates, a reminder of the invisible power driving this first-generation nuclear attack submarine through hostile water. Swordfish is a Skate-class boat, one of the early nuclear submarines that bridged the gap between the experimental days of Nautilus and the more refined Thresher and Sturgeon classes. She is about 268 feet long, with a beam of roughly 25 feet and a draft close to 20. Surfaced, she displaces around 2,570 tons. Submerged, about 2,160. One reactor, one shaft, two screws, good for more than 20 knots when pushed, but usually moving much slower on patrol to keep the noise down. Her bow houses an early active-passive sonar suite that, in the confined seas of the Western Pacific, can pick up Soviet shipping and submarines well beyond visual range when conditions cooperate. 8 533mm torpedo tubes give her teeth. She is not as quiet or as powerful as the boats that will follow, but in 1968, she is still a frontline hunter in the US Pacific Fleet. Her home port is Pearl Harbor, but the first weeks of 1968 have pulled her far from Hawaii. After a refueling and sub-safe overhaul completed in late 1967, Swordfish spent January and early February preparing for what the paperwork calls overseas movement. On the 3rd of February, she cleared Pearl for the Western Pacific, assigned to a deployment that will keep her submerged and far from home until early September. Her deck log will later summarize the period from 1 to 17 March with two bland words: Special Operations. The men on board know what that really means. They are going into waters close to the Soviet Union, into a region patrolled by Soviet surface ships, submarines, and aircraft, to conduct the kind of intelligence work the Navy rarely acknowledges even decades later. Tonight, that means operating at the edge of the winter ice. Swordfish is feeling her way along under loose pack, using sonar to listen for ice keels and solid flows, while the captain uses the periscope whenever he dares. Working under ice is delicate, unforgiving business. Too shallow, and the sail or periscope head will strike solid ice. Too deep, and the periscope becomes useless, leaving the boat blind to what might be lurking above. The sonar shack reports the sounds of ice grinding, a continuous low-frequency grumble, overlaid with sharper cracks as floes press and break. The diving officer fights to maintain a precise depth, counteracting the swell that reaches down from the surface and makes the boat bob subtly in the vertical even at several dozen feet. Every time the captain orders up periscope, everyone on watch feels a little clench in the gut. Steel and glass are about to poke into a world of solid objects they cannot fully see. The captain grips the periscope handles, forearms braced, hydraulics hiss, and the scope rises through the periscope well, through the sail, up toward the surface. In the control room, men feel a faint, familiar shiver run through the structure as the scope approaches air. Then, instead of the expected smooth break into open water, there is a jarring lurch. A harsh scraping rattles down the scope column, the unmistakable feel of metal grinding against something hard. The deck jumps underfoot. Someone swears. Instinctively, the captain yanks the handles down, ordering the scope lowered and the boat taken deeper. It is the nightmare everyone rehearses and hopes to avoid: contact between the periscope and ice. Moments later, when the scope is fully housed, a quick inspection tells the first part of the story. The periscope's motion is no longer smooth. Bearings that once turned freely feel stiff and reluctant. Later, when technicians can examine the head in detail, they will confirm that the scope has taken a heavy blow, its slender column bent enough to distort the optics and threaten the integrity of seals. In a war zone, the loss of a periscope is not a minor inconvenience. In the tight waters of the Sea of Japan, within reach of Soviet patrol craft and aircraft, it can be a mission-ending casualty. Without a trustworthy scope, Swordfish cannot safely operate at periscope depth for long, cannot take reliable visual fixes, cannot evaluate surface threats, and cannot effectively manage many of the intelligence-gathering tasks she was sent here to perform. In the wardroom, over hurried coffee and a chart spread out on the table, the captain and his senior officers talk through options. The damage is bad enough that they cannot simply press on and hope for the best. Repairing a bent scope at sea with the tools and spares carried aboard is unrealistic. Remaining in these waters blind would be reckless. The conclusion is unavoidable. Swordfish must break off the operation and head for a port capable of handling nuclear submarine repairs. That means Yokosuka, Japan, a major US base with the industrial muscle and security infrastructure to work on a damaged American SSN. Orders are drafted, transmitted up the chain via secure circuits, and eventually approved. Swordfish turns away from the ice and begins the careful withdrawal south. On 17th of March 1968, Swordfish noses into Yokosuka. From the pier, the damage is obvious. The sail structure shows fresh scars. The periscope is plainly not right. Japanese yard, workers, US sailors on neighboring boats, and local observers all see enough to know this submarine has had a bad time somewhere at sea. Within hours, rumors ripple through the base community. A nuclear submarine has arrived with collision damage. Some say she hit a ship, others say she hit ice. Dockyard workers tasked with assisting in the repairs pass along what they see to friends, and inevitably to reporters. It is impossible to hide a bent periscope in a peacetime port. The official explanation comes quickly. US Navy spokesmen say that Swordfish was operating under ice in the Sea of Japan when her periscope struck pack ice. No other vessel was involved. The story fits what the crew experienced, and it matches the kind of work everyone knows nuclear submarines do in northern waters. Under-ice navigation is dangerous. Even in peacetime, hitting ice with a scope or sail is a known risk. To most people in Yokosuka, the incident looks like a straightforward example of that hazard. A few photographs of the damaged sail circulate, but there is no indication, from what can be seen, that another submarine was involved. Repairs begin. Swordfish's log will show only that she arrived, entered availability, and then departed when the work was done. 9 days before Swordfish tied up in Yokosuka, far out in the North Pacific, another submarine had ended her patrol in the worst possible way. K-129, a Soviet Navy Golf II-class diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine, had sailed from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky with 3 nuclear-tipped SS-N5 missiles in her deck-mounted tubes and 98 men aboard. Her assigned patrol area lay in the Central Pacific, near the international date line, around 40 degrees north latitude. Somewhere out there, in deep water more than 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, she suffered a catastrophic event and went to the bottom. Soviet search forces scoured the region where they believed she should be. They found nothing. From Moscow's point of view, the timeline is uncomfortable. A Soviet strategic missile submarine disappears under mysterious circumstances. Not long afterward, an American nuclear submarine surfaces in Japan with obvious collision-like damage. The Soviet Navy, operating under layers of secrecy and suspicion, begins to connect dots. They know the Americans trail their boats when they can. They know collisions have occurred before between rival submarines. Lacking precise knowledge of Swordfish's track, some Soviet officers begin to argue that the American SSN may have rammed K-129, either accidentally while trailing or even as an act of deliberate aggression. In a system that often sees hostile intent behind every misfortune, the theory takes hold. Swordfish, to them, is the prime suspect. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, those accusations sound absurd. Swordfish's navigation data shows where she actually was between March 1st and March 17th, deployed to the Western Pacific, conducting special operations, then heading for Yokosuka. Classified acoustic records and later analyses place the fatal event that killed K-129 in a very different patch of ocean, roughly 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii and thousands of miles from the Sea of Japan. But none of that information can be shared publicly without revealing how the United States listens to the deep ocean. To American officials, the Soviet theory that Swordfish sank K-129 is not just wrong, it is geographically impossible. To Soviet officials, looking at a missing boat and a damaged American submarine, it is at least plausible enough to file away as a working suspicion. Inside Swordfish, life follows the familiar rhythm of a boat in port for repair. Yard workers clamber up scaffolding erected around the sail, removing damaged fairings and dismantling the periscope assembly. Sailors haul out equipment for calibration and test. Radiation control teams check and recheck the integrity of the reactor plant shielding as cutting and welding work proceed topside. The crew adjust to the strange combination of being in a foreign port, yet confined by security rules that limit where they can go and what they can discuss. They hear scraps of the emerging story about a missing Soviet submarine, but are not told the details. Intelligence briefings are tightly compartmented. For most of them, the priority is simple: get the boat fixed, get back to sea, and finish the deployment. Somewhere in the Pacific, hundreds of miles from where Swordfish now sits pierside, underwater microphones have already recorded the death of K-129. In quiet rooms in the United States, analysts listen to those tapes over and over, passing the low-frequency rumble and sharp transients of a hull collapsing under immense pressure. From the timing differences between widely separated hydroacoustic stations, they fix the approximate position of the event. From its acoustic character, they infer that a submarine imploded at great depth, perhaps after internal explosions. Nothing in the pattern suggests a glancing collision near the surface. Everything about it suggests a sudden, catastrophic failure far from the Sea of Japan. But in 1968, that story lives behind vault doors and classification stamps. In public, all anyone can see are three stark facts. K-129 is missing with all hands. Swordfish has arrived in Yokosuka with a smashed periscope, and neither superpower is willing to explain exactly what its submarines were doing when those things happened. Inside the Pentagon, and at out-of-the-way Navy facilities around the Pacific, the disappearance of K-129 is treated as both a tragedy and an opportunity. Almost as soon as Soviet search forces begin sweeping the ocean, US acoustic intelligence sites are tasked to go back through their recordings from early March. At ADAC, in the Aleutians, and at Air Force monitoring posts scattered across the Pacific, analysts rewind magnetic tapes and listen for anything out of the ordinary. They are working with data from SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, long lines of bottom-mounted hydrophones feeding signals back to shore through undersea cables. Built in the 1950s under deep secrecy, SOSUS was designed to detect the low-frequency sounds of submarines at long ranges. By 1968, it has matured into a global network, a kind of undersea ear tuned to the rumble of propellers and the dull thud of distant explosions. On recordings from early March, they find what they are looking for. Against the background hiss of the Pacific, there is a single, violent event. A sharp onset of energy, followed by a long, decaying rumble. Cross-checking data from multiple sites, analysts draw lines of bearing and triangulate a point in the empty ocean around 40 degrees north latitude near the international dateline. The water there is around 16,500 feet deep, far beyond the crush depth of any submarine. The timing and location match what little is known of K-129's patrol plan. The acoustic signature is consistent with a hull collapse or a massive internal explosion, followed by implosion, the death cry of a submarine. For the US Navy and the intelligence community, the conclusion is compelling. K-129 died here in mid-ocean, not in the constrained seas where Swordfish had been operating. That conclusion never sees the light of day. Admitting that the United States can pinpoint the destruction of a submarine thousands of miles away using fixed underwater microphones would reveal too much about SOSUS capabilities. At the very moment when the Soviet Union is racing to build quieter nuclear submarines, the American advantage in undersea listening is too valuable to compromise. So the analysis remains locked in classified files, circulated only among those with a strict need to know. Publicly, American spokesmen stick to a narrow line. Swordfish suffered ice damage in the Sea of Japan and was nowhere near any Soviet ballistic missile submarine when that boat went missing. They cannot prove that claim to Moscow without exposing their technological edge, and Moscow will not take them at their word. Inside the Soviet Navy, the search for K-129 becomes a grim exercise in futility. Surface ships and aircraft methodically work the region where the submarine ought to be if her patrol had gone as planned, dropping sonobuoys, dragging sonar, watching for oil slicks or wreckage. Nothing is found in that search box, because K-129 is not there. She is hundreds of miles away, in deep water, where the US acoustic fix places her. To some Soviet officers, especially those closest to the technical data, it becomes clear that the boat likely suffered a catastrophic internal accident. But at higher political levels, the coincidence of Swordfish's damage and K-129's disappearance remains tantalizing. It offers a simple, blame-shifting answer. The Americans did this. When Soviet intelligence officers obtain photographs of Swordfish in Yokosuka, sail scarred, periscope access panels open, work clearly underway, they fold them into a narrative already shaped by suspicion. To them, the damage looks like more than what pack ice alone might have done. Western analysis later suggests that the Soviet naval staff considered several collision scenarios, a glancing blow as the American submarine attempted to trail too closely, a near head-on encounter in which Swordfish's sail or bow struck K-129's hull, or even a ramming maneuver executed deliberately to disable a Soviet strategic asset. None of these theories fit the geography or what the Americans know from their own sensors, but clean external narratives seldom depend on messy internal facts. Project officers in the US intelligence community see K-129's loss through a different lens. To them, the wreck lying on the seafloor at a depth of more than 3 miles is an unparalleled intelligence target. A Gulf II-class submarine is an aging design by 1968 standards, but its missiles, warheads, guidance systems, and communications gear would all reveal valuable information about Soviet capabilities and design philosophies. Even more tempting are the cryptographic materials likely on board: codebooks, key lists, cipher machines. If any of those could be recovered intact, they might allow the United States to read Soviet naval traffic for months or years. The cost and complexity of doing so from 16,500 feet down are staggering, but the rewards are enough to push planners into seriously considering it. The concept that emerges over the next few years is astonishing in its audacity. Instead of sending a military ship bristling with obvious sensors, the United States will build a civilian-fronted, supposedly commercial vessel to go out over the wreck, open a massive hatch in its bottom, lower a giant mechanical claw to the seafloor, grab a section of the submarine, and haul it up, all while the Soviet Navy watches from a distance, believing they are witnessing an experiment in deep-sea mining. Under the cover of Howard Hughes's well-publicized interest in ocean resources, the CIA and the Navy will build the Glomar Explorer, a one-of-a-kind ship designed around a central moon pool and a towering derrick. Beneath her hull, a huge capture vehicle the engineers nicknamed Clementine will ride up and down on over a mile of steel pipe, like a drilling string, until it clamps around the broken hull of K-129. All of this grows directly out of what those SOSUS tapes and analytic plots showed in 1968. Without the precise location and depth of the wreck, no one in Langley or the Pentagon would have seriously suggested building a ship the size of a skyscraper on its side just to fish for a dead submarine. But with a fix within a few miles, the impossible begins to look merely extremely hard. For Swordfish's crew, meanwhile, the connection is almost invisible. They are not briefed into the compartment handling K-129. The captain and navigator know more than the junior sailors, but even they see only fragments of the larger picture. Their experience of early 1968 remains defined by a jarring encounter with ice, an unplanned repair stop in Yokosuka, and the uneasy knowledge that somewhere out there, a Soviet boat never came home. Swordfish leaves Japan once her periscope and sail are repaired, rejoining the rotation of Western Pacific operations, patrols, exercises, surveillance of Soviet naval movements out of Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. The formal accusations from the Soviet side that she was responsible for sinking K-129 filter down slowly, more through rumor and the occasional intelligence brief than through any official communique. For the officers, the charge is infuriating. They know their track, they know their charts, they know where they were and where they were not. Quietly, among themselves, they talk about the absurdity of being blamed for an accident thousands of miles away. But they also know that undersea collisions do happen, that other boats on both sides have bumped each other in the dark, and that the line between accident and act of war can be thin when viewed through the lens of Cold War paranoia. If you'd like to explore this story in greater depth, there are links in the description to books and declassified documents that go into the loss of K-129, the role of SOSUS, and the full story of Project Azorian. Those resources helped shape this episode and offer technical and historical detail that simply won't fit on screen. They also support this channel and help Cold War Chronicles keep producing deep dive investigations into the invisible war beneath the waves. Back in the Soviet Union, the political handling of K-129's loss follows a sadly familiar pattern. Families are notified in formulaic language that their husbands, sons, and fathers have died in the line of duty. The circumstances are not explained. There is no location given, no wreck site to visit. Within the officer corps, the event enters whispered lore as another of the fleet's many unspoken tragedies. For a time, some Soviet analytic work suggests that an internal explosion in the missile compartment, perhaps during a failed launch drill, might have triggered the disaster. Other theories point to battery gas explosions or torpedo accidents, both recurring hazards in diesel-electric submarines. Officially, however, little is said. Admitting that a strategic missile boat simply blew up on her own is politically unpalatable. Blaming an American collision partner is easier. The Americans, with their classified tapes, images, and later recovered wreckage, do not share that view. Within the Navy and CIA, the working hypothesis is that K-129 suffered an internal casualty, possibly a misfire or malfunction involving one of her Saoku missiles that led to a rapid, uncontrollable loss of buoyancy and hull integrity. Acoustic data suggests an initial smaller event followed by a major structural failure. Photographic surveys from deep-diving camera sleds towed over the site show the hull broken into sections, missile tubes ripped open, debris spread along the bottom. None of the patterns match what engineers would expect from a glancing blow with another submarine near the surface. Everything about the wreckage screams catastrophe from within. Swordfish's name appears in no declassified planning documents for Project Azorian. By the time Glomar Explorer reaches the recovery site in 1974, Swordfish is years older and already fading from the cutting edge of the attack submarine force. That gap between the public myth that she murdered a Soviet boat in the dark and the internal reality that she was inconveniently in the headlines when someone else's submarine failed catastrophically becomes a kind of case study in how Cold War rivalries warped perception. Each side believed what fit its fears and interests. The truth, sitting under 3 miles of water and in locked classified files, had to wait for a very different era to surface. In Washington, the disappearance of K-129 quickly stops being just a Soviet problem. The acoustic event northwest of Hawaii has given the United States something far more concrete than rumors and accusations: a likely position on the seafloor where a Soviet ballistic missile submarine lies broken in the dark. In an era when every missile, every warhead, and every codebook can tip the balance of deterrence, that is not simply a tragedy, it is an opportunity. Inside windowless rooms in the Pentagon and at Langley, Navy and CIA officers sketch the outlines of an audacious idea. If the wreck can be found, maybe some of it can be lifted. And if it can be lifted, maybe the United States can peer directly into the secrets of Soviet strategic warfare. But the ocean does not give up its dead easily. The depth at the estimated site is in the neighborhood of 16,500 feet. No submarine can dive that far. No existing salvage ship can reach it with cables strong enough to haul up a steel cylinder thousands of tons heavy. At that depth, water pressure is around 8,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush all but the most specialized equipment. Traditional Navy salvage doctrine says that anything below a few thousand feet is, for practical purposes, gone forever. The people being gathered around the table now are not traditional salvers. They are engineers, covert operators, and contractors used to being told that something cannot be done and then being asked to do it anyway. The proposal that emerges is almost science fiction. Build a ship unlike any other, a massive, open-centered vessel that can straddle the wreck site and lower a gigantic mechanical claw, what engineers will later call the capture vehicle, down 3 miles to grasp a large section of K-129's hull. Disguise the entire operation as deep-sea mining research, using cover stories about harvesting manganese nodules from the abyssal plain. Recruit a private industrial figure with enough wealth and eccentricity to make the cover story believable. Hoist the captured hull section up into a hidden moon pool inside the ship's belly, where it can be examined in secret. Then sail away, leaving the Soviets none the wiser. It is bold, risky, breathtakingly expensive, and exactly the kind of project that appeals to a Cold War leadership used to thinking in terms of billion-dollar bomber programs and global intelligence contests. Within months, that outline has a name: Project Azorian. To the outside world, and even to many of the people working on the hardware, it will be associated with another name, one designed to draw attention in exactly the right way. Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire whose companies are already experimenting with exotic ocean mining concepts, agrees to lend his corporate brand as camouflage. On paper, the giant ship being designed at Sun Shipbuilding in Pennsylvania is the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a commercial deep-sea mining vessel meant to pioneer the extraction of metal-rich nodules from the deep ocean floor. In reality, every major structural decision is driven by a classified requirement: lift a chunk of a Soviet submarine from 3 miles down without snapping the lifting string or capsizing the ship. As the Glomar Explorer takes shape, the CIA and the Navy refine estimates of what exactly might still be intact on the bottom. Early imagery from deep submergence camera sleds towed over the wreck site reveals K-129 lying broken into several major sections, surrounded by scattered debris. The forward part, containing the torpedo room and some crew compartments, appears badly damaged. The middle part, where the missile compartment and sail are located, seems more structurally coherent. The aft section, with the engineering spaces and screws, lies twisted but recognizable. Engineers decide to target a central hull segment roughly 130 to 140 feet long, encompassing missile tubes, control spaces, and equipment of the greatest intelligence value. Meanwhile, in Soviet naval headquarters, another sort of planning is underway. The official investigation into K-129's disappearance remains tightly held. Conclusions about the cause, an explosion during a missile drill, a catastrophic hull breach, perhaps a battery or torpedo accident, are argued behind closed doors. Families are told as little as possible. There is no public admission that a nuclear-armed submarine lies on the ocean floor outside Soviet territorial waters. Naval officers who suspect that the Americans may mount a salvage attempt have no clear way to prove it, and even less leverage to stop it. The distances involved are too great. The region is too vast. Any large, foreign ship there can plausibly claim to be fishing, surveying, or prospecting. The same secrecy that shields Soviet embarrassment also blinds Soviet response. Back at Pearl Harbor, Swordfish continues her career. Repairs completed, she returns to sea in mid-1968 to finish out her Western Pacific deployment. Her logs show normal port calls, training, and operations. The men who were aboard during the periscope strike file, their memories alongside all the other near misses that make up a submariner's informal war stories. Some hear whisperings that Moscow has blamed them for K-129's loss. A few bristle at the accusation. Others shrug. In their world, misinformation and propaganda are expected. When Swordfish eventually decommissions in 1989, after 3 decades' service, she carries no official crest or marking that hints at any connection to a lost Soviet boat. The ship's history, as written in unclassified references, makes only a brief note of an under-ice collision with pack ice in 1968. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. By the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer is ready. She is enormous, over 600 feet long, with a displacement rivaling that of an aircraft carrier. From the outside, she looks like an ungainly industrial ship married to an oil rig, cranes and gantries bristling above an oddly tall central structure. Hidden within that structure is the heart of Azorian, the moon pool, a cavernous well open to the sea through the bottom of the hull, and the towering derrick that will lower and raise the capture vehicle. Beneath the ship, when she reaches the target coordinates, a thick string of steel pipe sections will descend to the seabed, each joint carefully torqued, the whole assembly designed to support millions of pounds in tension without buckling. At the far end of that string waits the mechanical claw, its articulated fingers ready to embrace the shattered remains of K-129. The transit to the recovery site is conducted under the fiction of mining exploration. Notices to mariners and diplomatic communications describe a deep-sea research expedition. When the ship arrives northwest of Hawaii and stations herself over the wreck, Soviet vessels take notice, but do not fully grasp what is happening. A few trawlers move closer to observe, keeping a wary eye on the strange American ship with its central opening to the sea. For their crews, the official Soviet line is that the Americans might be testing real deep-sea mining gear, something Moscow is politically inclined to oppose, but not necessarily in a position to stop. No one tells them that a piece of a Soviet submarine lies below. Lowering the capture vehicle is a slow, nerve-wracking process. Each length of pipe added to the string increases the weight and the risk. Engineers monitor stresses, constantly. A sudden storm, an unexpected swell, or a miscalculation in ballast could snap the line or tear the ship itself apart. As the claw nears the depth of the wreck, sophisticated sonar and camera systems guide its approach. For the first time, American eyes see K-129 not as a blurry outline on a towed camera film strip, but as a real object, twisted steel resting in silence on the dark seabed. The capture fingers, each the size of a small truck, close around the chosen hull section. Hydraulic locks engage. Sensors confirm a grip. On the surface, the order is given to begin the lift. For hours and then days, the Glomar Explorer inches her prize upward. The strain on the riser system grows immense. Engineers watch for any sign of buckling or fatigue. Somewhere near the halfway point, deep underwater, where no human can intervene, part of the plan fails. Later reconstructions suggest that as the captured hull section left the seabed and began to bear its full weight on the claw, structural elements of K-129's hull gave way. A portion of the targeted section breaks loose and falls back to the bottom, taking with it some of the missile compartment and whatever secrets it held. But not all. When the battered remnant finally reaches the moon pool, it brings with it fragments of the submarine's midsection, portions of the hull, some internal spaces, and grimly, the remains of several Soviet sailors. What exactly was recovered in terms of hardware and documents remains one of the most closely guarded aspects of Azorian. Declassified summaries hint at missile components, fire control gear, and perhaps some cryptologic material. Other accounts suggest that the most sensitive cryptographic devices and current codebooks were in the part of the hull that slipped away. What is clear is that at least 6 bodies came up with the wreckage, identifiable as K-129 crewmen from their uniforms and personal effects. The Americans now face an ethical and political dilemma layered atop the technical and intelligence questions. They have, in effect, become custodians of foreign war dead, whose government does not even admit where they lie. The decision taken at the time is to conduct a burial at sea with full military honors, recorded on film in case it is ever appropriate to share it. Inside the moon pool, chaplains read words of committal. An American honor guard fires a salute. The bodies, placed in weighted containers, are lowered gently into the Pacific. No Russian relatives are informed. No Soviet officials are consulted. The service is both genuine and deeply secret, a peculiar intersection of respect and espionage. The film and documentation are locked away, classified for decades. Only in the 21st century will the United States quietly provide copies of the burial footage to Russian authorities as a gesture of transparency and closure. If you'd like to explore this story in greater depth, there are books and declassified documents that go much further into Project Azorian and the loss of K-129, works by naval historians and investigative journalists that unpack engineering diagrams, internal memos, and personal accounts from those involved. Links to some of those resources are in the description. They support the channel and, more importantly, help preserve the memory and complexity of what really happened out there. For the men of Swordfish, watching all this unfold from a distance, the story resolves in an odd mix of vindication and irrelevance. The more that leaks out about the location of K-129's wreck and the details of Project Azorian, the clearer it becomes that their boat could not have been involved in the sinking. Swordfish was in the Sea of Japan, putting her periscope into ice. K-129 died thousands of miles away, in deep water northwest of Hawaii. The geography speaks louder than propaganda. Yet the accusation that an American submarine rammed and destroyed a Soviet missile boat never entirely disappears from certain corners of Russian discourse. Myths, once born in secrecy and anger, are hard to kill. Swordfish herself leaves the stage before the full story becomes public. She spends the 1970s and early 1980s doing what fast attack submarines do, trailing Soviet units, exercising with carrier groups, collecting signals, and disappearing beneath ice and thermocline. By the time she is decommissioned in the late 1980s and enters the nuclear ship recycling program at Bremerton, newer classes have taken over the most sensitive missions. Her reactor compartment is cut out and shipped to a secure disposal site in the northwest. Her hull is dismantled, pieces of HY-80 and structural steel reduced to scrap. No museum preserves her sail. No plaque in a public park records that she was once at the center of a Soviet accusation tied to one of the Cold War's darkest mysteries. Only with the partial declassification of Azorian and the release of some K-129 analyses in the 1990s and 2000s does the broader public begin to see the outline of what really happened in early 1968. Articles in naval history journals describe the search for the lost Soviet boat, the acoustic localization, and the engineering feats required to touch it at all. CIA museum exhibits quietly acknowledge that the Glomar Explorer's true purpose was not mining, but covert salvage. Commentators draw connections between that mission and the now famous phrase, "We can neither confirm nor deny," born when reporters first pressed the agency about rumors of a giant spy ship raising a Russian sub. If this investigation into USS Swordfish, K-129, and Project Azorian has moved you, please take a moment to like this video, Subscribe to Cold War Chronicles and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the Invisible War. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, or if you or your family members served aboard submarines. During the Cold War, your stories and memories are part of preserving this history. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps these forgotten stories reach more people who need to hear them. You are part of ensuring these sailors and their sacrifices are not forgotten. In the end, the story is not simply about whether Swordfish hit ice or steel, or exactly how many feet of K-129's hull the Glomar Explorer managed to lift. It is about the logic of a time when both superpowers believed that control of the undersea domain and the information hidden there could decide the fate of continents. A Soviet missile submarine vanishes. An American attack boat arrives in port dented. A handful of men in Washington decide to build a ship capable of reaching 3 miles down just to see what secrets lie in the wreckage. Families in the Soviet Far East mourn sons and husbands whose graves are an invisible line on a chart. Sailors on both sides keep silent for decades. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Invisible War, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have only just scratched the surface of the secrets buried beneath the waves. Thank you for helping ensure that the crews of USS Swordfish, K-129, and all those who rowed these steel coffins into the deep are not forgotten.